Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is a discussion that was suggested by I guess we would call him my co-host for this, my co-facilitator, King Crocoduck. He sent me a private message in response to a video I did a couple weeks ago about feminism and the YouTube atheist community, and he wanted to have a discussion about that, but framed in a slightly different context than I have really seen it discussed before. So we're going to be talking about that for about the next 2 hours. I'm sure that there will be things that we'll agree on and disagree on, but hopefully I think we're both determined that this is going to be a friendly and cordial exchange. So before I turn it over to King Crocoduck, who is sort of going to lead the discussion, there's nothing wrong with your screens. Do not attempt to adjust the picture. Neither of us will be using a webcam for this, so you'll get to gaze on our beautifully rendered user pics for the next 2 hours. It'll be kind of like a podcast. Imagine just close your eyes and imagine it like a podcast. It'll be theater of the mind. But anyway, having made that explanation, let me turn the proceedings over to my guest, the great King Crocoduck. Crocoduck, how you doing, my friend?
Good. How are you, Steve?
I am so good, it's not even funny.
Well, I'm not doing so well. I'm going to have to apologize to everyone for my voice. I'm a little bit sick. I've been catching that flu that everybody's been getting. So, yeah, do excuse that. Anyway, I wanted to have this conversation with you, Steve, after I saw your video about how feminism and atheism need to be more closely married within the YouTube community. And it occurred to me, after sort of watching from the sidelines for a very long time, seeing this entire thing play out, that this argument between the sort of feminist side of atheism and the, well, not feminist side of atheism, it seems to me to be sort of an extension of the science wars. For those who don't know, the science wars were these series of struggles in the 90s and early 2000s between social scientists and natural sciences. The disagreements were largely based around the postmodernists the postmodernism that was starting to really take hold within the social sciences. And this was going against the scientific realism that the natural sciences were really endorsing. So I think this is an extension of that because the YouTube atheist epistemology seems to be based very firmly upon scientific realism. I myself consider myself a model-dependent realist. I won't go into detail about what that is. You can read about it in Stephen Hawking's and Leonard Mlodinow's The Grand Design. But it does run in opposition to what postmodernism is saying, that everybody is fundamentally influenced by their surroundings, by their positions in society. And from this, you get things that are sort of the basis of the epistemology of third-wave feminism. That is things like standpoint theory, which leads in very strongly into intersectionality. You have all these different epistemologies that come into third-wave feminism that seem to be, at least in the minds of many YouTube atheists, in opposition to the scientific realism that we all seem to embrace. In particular, Popperian falsifiability. That's something that's pretty huge, and it's probably going to come up again and again in this discussion. Mm-hmm. So, if you have no idea about anything that I've just said, that's okay. We're about to define everything that we're about to talk about. Steve, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about what intersectionality is?
Well, yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, and I figured that was when you suggested that part of what we would discuss in this would be standpoint theory. I figured that intersectionality would come up because those two do definitely go hand in hand. Intersectionality is basically the idea that different forms of oppression or marginalization, disadvantagement, what have you, intersect and overlap with each other and can amplify each other. For instance, and we most commonly hear this term discussed in terms of feminism, because I think feminist theory is what really originated and popularized the idea of intersectionality. And intersectionality would say that, an intersectional feminist would say that the experience of a Black woman would be necessarily unique to the experience of, let's just say, a white woman or a woman from any specific racial background. That we all are either privileged or underprivileged in multiple categories at the same time, and that it's essential to recognize this and to keep this in mind. And it's important not just when social movements are sort of interacting with each other. So you have a feminist movement that isn't an enemy of, say, a racial civil rights movement. It's also important when you're looking within your own movement. So you can say, okay, let's say we have a feminist movement. We need to make sure that the feminist movement that we are pushing, that we are using to pursue social change, is something that is of use not just for the most privileged members of that movement. So if you have a feminist movement that is primarily focusing on and centering on the most privileged women in, let's just say, the United States, then it is not doing the most amount of good that it could be doing. It's not actually serving all of the people that it should be serving. It needs to take into account and make an effort to center and to amplify the voices and the concerns of the most marginalized members of its community, racial minorities, people of low income, people who have health issues or mental health issues, people who are already disadvantaged in addition to the fact that they're disadvantaged because they're women. So that's basically what intersectionality is. It's recognizing that the feminist movement, or really, in my opinion, anything that fancies itself a social movement, should keep in mind that it cannot, if it wants to be truly effective, it can't just center itself on the people in its movement or affected by its movement that are already the most privileged. It has to center itself on the least privileged members of its community or of its movement.
A good way to visualize how intersectionality plays out, how it works, I find, is to think of it in terms of pyramids. We can all, when I was growing up, when we were talking about history in class, about how certain groups were above others, for like the feudal system in Europe, where you have nobles at the top and workers beneath them, and on and on and on, lower and lower and lower, and serfs at the bottom, yada, yada, yada. We called these social structures. There was the social economic pyramid. Nowadays, the whatchamacallit, what's the term I'm looking for? The fashionable term to use, I guess, is power structure. So I'll honor that. You can think of these different power structures as pyramids: rich at the top, middle class in the middle, poor at the bottom. And this can be extended to basically other things. In the case of feminism and patriarchy, the top, women at the bottom. In the case of, for example, a heteronormative pyramid, as some might call it, you would have at the top heterosexual people, in the middle bisexual people, at the bottom transnormative pyramid, as others might call it. You would have, I guess, cis people at the top, and then transgendered people at the bottom, and on it goes. You have all of these different pyramids, and one of the biggest debates inside of intersectionality, as far as I can tell, is which pyramid weighs the most, which pyramid contributes the most to a person's disenfranchisement within our society. And we'll probably talk a little bit later about some of the problems involved here. But this, I think, is a pretty good way of visualizing it. Just think of it as a bunch of pyramids, and the people at the top of some pyramids can be at the bottom of other pyramids.
Right.
So intersectionality was largely motivated, as I understand it, by standpoint theory. And this is something that actually originated in neo-Marxism. It was this revision of the original Marx and Engels type of ideas that came for reasons I'll probably get to when I talk about Karl Popper. But basically, standpoint theory is saying that we all have certain standpoints. It's this position in society when you look at the world and form your opinion of it, and your interpretation of the world is based on where you are. You know, if you're at the top of the pyramid, you're going to have a different view of the world than someone who's at the bottom of the pyramid. A way of thinking about this is, imagine a factory where you have a foreman and you have workers. And the standpoint of the foreman, he understands what the foreman wants. He understands how the factory should work. He understands what the end product should be. But according to standpoint theory, he doesn't really have any incentive to understand how the workers think. The workers, their standpoints aren't really that important to him. He has no incentive to understand that. The workers, on the other hand, according to standpoint theory, will understand his standpoint better, and they'll understand their own standpoint as well. They'll know what they want, and they know what the foreman wants. And they need to know what the foreman wants because they have the incentive to know what he wants. And this is referred to as double vision. The idea, when this is applied culturally, when this is applied to intersectionality via cultural Marxism, you end up with people who are at the bottom of the pyramid. The idea is that they have a better view of how society works than the people at the top. They have a more broad understanding of how everything works. And this is where I think the first contentions can start. I'm not entirely sure that this assumption is justified, that the people at the bottom have a better view, a more rounded view of how the world works than the people at the top. And it's important to think about, why standpoint theory, where it might be strong and where it might be weak, because this is sort of one of the most foundational bases of third wave feminism. And it leads to a lot of very controversial things. Like I think Anita Sarkeesian has this very infamous sort of listen and believe type of mantra. In one of your earlier videos, you ended with saying something along the lines of, and you can correct me here, if a woman is telling you about her experiences, shut the fuck up, and she might have something to say. She knows what she's talking about.
Right.
Something along those lines.
Yeah.
And it allows, standpoint theory allows it to be the case that, for example, men can't really, what's the point I'm looking for? Men can't really argue against the personal experience of a woman, but a woman can potentially argue against the personal experience of a man. And this is because she has a broader view of society than he does, according to standpoint theory. So I think that there's some room here for contention. I would contend that the groups at the bottom of the social hierarchy of a power structure would have just as much incentive to interpret the world in a way that benefits them. There are some other things as well, but where in particular it conflicts with the epistemology of YouTube atheists, I think that the big problem here is this sort of privilege to knowledge, this epistemic privilege that standpoint theory grants to certain people by virtue of the fact that they were born in a certain position. That people will intrinsically know more simply because they were born at the bottom of a certain pyramid. This probably, I think, doesn't sit so well with a lot of atheists because it forcibly reminds them of how, for example, a Christian just knows that God exists. You argue with a presuppositionalist, they'll say something along the lines of, I have this axiom that God exists. God has revealed himself to me in a way that is satisfactory for him. And that's how I know God exists. It seems to me that there are some potentially disturbing parallels here.
Well, let me jump in here. I'm getting a little bit of an echo, by the way. I don't know if you have sound on your side or not, but okay, it's gone now. I was hearing my own voice. I've heard that before. I've heard people make that comparison. of how is it any different than a Christian saying they just know that God exists? And I would object to that on the basis that I don't see how you can say that social oppression is analogous to the existence of God. The implication is that there's no evidence for it. That you're basically being asked to take people's word that oppression exists, as if there is no objective way of verifying it. And I think socially and economically, I don't see how anyone could seriously argue that it's better for some folks than it is for others, and that there are people who live in underprivileged positions relative to other people through no fault of their own. And if you want to argue that that people will naturally sort of tend to interpret the world in a way that is beneficial to them, I wouldn't really argue with you about that. I think that's just a natural human tendency, and I would never try to say that I or people that I tend to agree with don't do that. I think everybody sort of tries to interpret the world in a way that would be more beneficial to them, at least naturally. I mean, we can try to correct for these biases if we find them, but I think naturally people just always tend to do that. My problem is that a lot of the people who disagree with me within the atheist community on things I've said about feminism, I don't think they realize that they're doing that. I think they have an attitude of, well, I'm talking about the objective truth, and you're the one who's bringing in all this emotion and all this listen and believe stuff. And if we could all just agree that everybody tends to interpret things based on their own biases or their own prejudices, I think we would be further along than we are. The problem is that I get comments from people quite a lot, and almost entirely just on this issue. I don't get it when I talk about gay rights or trans rights. I get it a little bit when I talk about trans rights, but not that much. When I talk about racism, when I talk about any other form of oppression, I don't get the same pushback. But when I talk about feminism, I get these people saying, oh, the patriarchy is imaginary, and it's the same as when an apologist says, that he just knows that God is there because God speaks to him through his heart. And that doesn't sound to me like someone who is aware that he's interpreting the world in a way that's beneficial to him. That sounds to me like someone who is quite certain that he has an objective view of reality that I am somehow missing. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So you bring up a fair point when it comes to evidence. And which particular evidence is more reliable than another. I don't really want to get into that.
Right.
I know there's an active discussion about things like the wage gap, the 1 in 5 figure, the 2% figure, all these different things.
Right.
And both sides, I have heard pretty good arguments from both sides. I'm not just, trying to appease anybody here. On the one hand, I've heard some excellent explanations for how the 1 in 5 figure, for example, might be conflated. On the other hand, I've heard excellent explanations, in particular this one video from Concordance, showing that the 1 in 5 figure is pretty legit. Same holds true for the wage gap, same holds true for other things. So I don't really want to get into the evidence, but when we're talking about the underlying principle, independently of evidence, if we just leave evidence out of the picture and just consider the underlying epistemology on its own, it would seem to me that you have this. Well, let's back up for a second. You have one Christian claiming that God exists, and you have, for example, a feminist woman saying that patriarchy exists, and they the effects of these different entities. In evidence notwithstanding, the argument could strike people as being fundamentally the same. I'm in this epistemologically privileged position where I'm able to have this unique sort of knowledge, and you can't have this knowledge too until you begin to sort of agree that there's some merit to what I'm saying. This might be the attitude that that a scientific realist might give in response. This is without the evidence. Remember, we're leaving evidence completely out of this. Whether the evidence is in support of or against patriarchy, I don't want to get into that. I'll leave that to the people who talk about that sort of thing. But the underlying epistemology is something that might be cause for concern. because it does say that some people intrinsically will have a better understanding of how reality works.
Well, I think the argument is it's not so much, at least from where I sit, and I'm not claiming to speak. I'm certainly as especially as a man, I'm certainly not claiming to speak for all feminists. And I recognize that there are many who might find this very conversation to be somewhat problematic because it's two dudes talking about feminism.
Well, of course, that's if they subscribe to standpoint theory.
But it goes along with. I do think I don't necessarily think that a member of an oppressed or underprivileged group is necessarily, an infallible source for something. But I do think that it's a reasonable principle and a reasonable assumption to make that a person that has experienced a form of social oppression firsthand will have a more nuanced understanding of it than someone who is looking at it from the outside, especially looking at it from the outside from a more privileged position. I can say this from my own personal experience as a relatively privileged person. The few times that I have been in situations where I felt like I was getting maybe just a little taste of what it's like to be an underprivileged person, like say, I don't know, maybe some people have had the experience of where you go to a restaurant that serves what we white Americans would refer to as an ethnic cuisine, like you're in an Ethiopian restaurant or a Mexican restaurant or something, and you all of a sudden become aware that you're the only white person in there. That's happened to me once or twice. And there's a moment that it's when you have that recognition, it's a little bit, at least for me, it's a little bit disorienting. And I wonder, and I the impression I get from folks that I talk to about this is that members of racial minorities in the United States have that feeling a lot, because they often find themselves in situations where they are surrounded by white folks and they're the only person of color around, or the people of color that they are there with are vastly outnumbered by the white folks. Or that it just feels like an alien experience to them. They feel like they're visiting another country when they're in that situation. And I have no idea what it's like to not only live my life every day with that kind of feeling coming up over and over again, but also to know that myself and people like me have greater hurdles to jump and have greater barriers to cross, more difficult barriers to cross socially and economically than a white person would have. So if I were trying as a white person to have an understanding of racial oppression, or if I were trying as a man to have a deeper understanding of gender discrimination, I don't see why I wouldn't want to base as much of my thoughts and feelings and opinions on the experiences of people who have actually lived through it. I don't know what I as a man or I as a white person can really say about that kind of discrimination and that kind of oppression that would be all that useful,
I wonder, though, if maybe this is a bit of a conflation between the individualist and the collectivist mindset. From my personal experience, I come from Los Angeles. I grew up on the East Side when I was a kid. It's not the nicest place to live. A lot of brown folk. It's like more than 50% Hispanic where I'm from. I wasn't really keenly aware of this as I grew up. The environment sort of molded me away from this sort of, all brown people experience this sort of thing the same, all black people experience this thing the same, all white people experience this thing the same. And when I consider standpoint theory, I do see a danger, and it has been acknowledged by scholars who subscribe to this theory. I see a danger of perhaps overgeneralizing, of sort of taking the collective experience and applying it to all individuals. This I think is actually kind of a recurring theme through third wave feminism that, I don't know, for example, an egalitarian might find distasteful. What do you think about that?
Well, you mean an egalitarian would find it distasteful
to take a very general experience and apply it to every individual?
Right, right. Well, that's always, I think we're right to see that that could potentially be a problem. I mean, I think the difficulty of going from the specific to the universal is always going to be a problem, you know, but I think when you have enough individuals having roughly similar experiences, I mean, the idea of women being oppressed is not based on the experiences of a tiny handful of women. It seems to be a very widespread phenomenon. So of course, you have to be careful with saying, well, you know, this woman says that she experiences the world this way, therefore we should, you know, extrapolate that as the general experience of women. That's dangerous, and that can lead to inaccuracies and sort of a tilted picture of things. But when the problem is as widespread and as universal and as historically long-standing as something like gender inequality, I don't know if that is that practical of a concern. I mean, I think it's good to have that conversation. It's good to be aware that that philosophical problem exists, and it's good to be vigilant to make sure we're not, you know, trying to reason the general from the specific in a way that will warp our conclusions. But I mean, if someone, I keep getting hung up on the term egalitarian, because an egalitarian, in principle, in a perfect world, an egalitarian would be a wonderful thing to be, because most egalitarians express a desire, and I'm sure that they're very sincere in this, that they want equality for everybody. And I think they really mean that. I don't think that you know, most people who identify as egalitarian are doing so with any kind of willful animus toward anybody. I think they genuinely believe that that's the most reasonable position to take. But I can't help but think that folks who think that that is the most reasonable position to take in terms of discrimination aren't really kind of missing the boat on the nature of the discrimination that actually exists. Because if everything was equal, and you know, let's say men and women both experienced discrimination at roughly the same rate, or were affected by it in roughly the same proportion, then it would make more sense. But when you have a situation where women are clearly the more oppressed group, it sounds a little bit like the folks who have a problem with Black Lives Matter activists, because they say, well, all lives should matter. You know, you're sort of ignoring the problem that created the group that centers on one group over the other in the first place.
All right. Well, with regard to particular disenfranchisement,
Right.
This is the only time in the conversation where I'm actually going to get into evidence as opposed to just philosophy.
I apologize for forcing you to do that.
No, it's all right. It's all right. In the case where you have a societal sort of attitude that disenfranchises a group versus actual laws that are consecrated into our legal framework, when it comes to oppression, which do you think would take precedence in terms of our what we should prioritize? Should we prioritize demolishing an attitude, or should we prioritize demolishing a law? As far as discrimination is concerned, you know, maybe you have a law that discriminates against somebody, and then you have a societal attitude that discriminates against a person. Which one do you think takes precedence?
Well, to me, the law would take precedence, because that, practically speaking, is probably the easiest to correct.
I agree with you, and that's why I think there might be a bit of a disconnect here. As far as I understand, there are no laws in this country that actively discriminate against women. Patriarchy, as we're told nowadays, it's a lot more subtle. It's not as loud as it used to be. That being said, I can think of several laws that do discriminate against men. I would think that if the demolition of legal inequalities takes precedence over the demolition of attitude-based inequalities. I would think that perhaps you would be more interested, maybe, in going in that direction.
Well, you're saying that we should take care of all the legal inequalities first before we worry about the social inequalities? I mean, that doesn't really make sense to me. That really doesn't make sense to me, considering the fact that even though we have achieved a much greater degree of legal equality for women than there used to be, say, 50 years ago, women do still suffer from inequalities on the basis of cultural and social factors. And to say, well, let's worry about all of those after we correct the relative handful of legal inequalities that might negatively affect men, just seems to me, again, it sounds like trying to pretend that inequalities that men face because they are men are somehow comparable in scale to the inequalities that women face because they are women. And whether these equalities be legal in nature or cultural or societal in nature, I don't see how you can make an argument that the inequality faced by men on the basis of them being men is anywhere near as serious or as widespread of a problem as that faced by women.
I wouldn't go as far as to suggest that the legal inequalities faced by men constitute suppression. But I would think I would think that it would make sense for a movement dedicated to equality to go after the law first. Before
I agree with you.
I mean, before you get everybody to say, for example, okay, being gay is okay, before you can really have that widespread, you need to legalize gay marriage. You need to outlaw sodomy laws. You need to, before you get people to respect black people, you have to free the slaves. Before you start to desegregate, you have to say that black people are fully human.
Right.
It seems to me historically, the best route to take has always been to, I don't know, go for the laws before the culture. But that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, no,
that's the end of my spiel on evidence.
I completely agree with you. And I mean, I will say the laws or the cultural norms that do disadvantage men are things that I would like to see done away with as well. And so would most feminists. I mean,
of course, I hear this quite a lot.
Yeah, the examples that get brought up most frequently that I hear are male circumcision and the military draft. And I would love to see the draft either be done away with completely or be made gender equal. I'm completely in favor of that. And I think, I mean, the National Organization of Women has supported that for 40 years. I would love to see circumcision fall out of fashion and not be practiced anymore. I think that would be terrific, or at least not be such a default procedure that everybody just kind of does for their male children. I think that would be great,
Right. I agree with the spirit. I do think that, on paper, it does seem to be the case that feminists everywhere would agree with these points. But there does seem to be a disproportionate amount of effort toward resolving these legal inequalities.
Well, because feminism is centered on women. I mean, I think it's as simple as that. I mean, the feminist movement is centered on women.
Yeah, I think I would agree as to that being the cause. I wouldn't agree that that's the right thing, especially if you embrace intersectionality. But
you don't think the feminist movement should be centered on women? It's right there in the name.
Well, if feminism is going to embrace intersectionality,
Right.
It can't really be just about women anymore. I mean, as the saying goes, feminism was created by white rich men. I think that a change is something that's it's something that should be invited.
Well, I don't think I think to say that intersectional feminism shouldn't be centered on women is a little bit of a misunderstanding of intersectionality. Intersectionality doesn't mean that you can't center on a particular group. Intersectionality doesn't mean that you have to be all things to all people. And I think that's actually kind of a misunderstanding that I've seen people have from my atheism and feminism video, where they seem to think that my suggestion that the atheist movement would be better off if feminism were a more embraced, quality, or a more embraced philosophy within the YouTube section of the atheist movement, that somehow I'm suggesting that it needs to, that both separate movements need to die and be reborn as this, combined super movement that will replace these separate atheist and feminist movements. And that's not what I'm saying at all. And that's not what intersectionality requires. It just requires an awareness and a willingness to lift up the marginalized voices.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree with this sort of super atheist movement thing.
Right. Yeah, and you've never said that, but that is a very that seems to be a lot of the people who.
I just want to clarify my position before I go on.
No, go ahead.
But I do think that it would be very healthy for intersectionality to not be centered on women's issues. I think that it kind of defeats the purpose. It sort of prioritizes one oppressed group over a
non-oppressed group. Men are not the oppressed group.
No, I'm not saying that men are oppressed. I'm just saying that it doesn't really make much sense to me for a movement that has as much potential as intersectionality to center itself on one particular group.
Well, intersectionality,
I would make the same argument if it centered itself on a completely different pyramid. Let's walk away from this male female patriarchy pyramid for a second,
right, and
go over to the heteronormative pyramid. If it just focused on, for example, gay pyramid on the heteronormative pyramid, it's placing more emphasis on that pyramid than any other pyramid. I'm not sure that that's the right way to go about doing things. I think that unless you can, I'll get to this potential experiment I'm thinking of.
Okay.
Unless you can perform a sort of experiment to show which group or which combination of groups results in the most oppressed person, all of these pyramids need to be treated on equal ground.
Well, but I think I have no problem with the various pyramids being treated equally, but I think the different levels of the pyramid have to be acknowledged as being different. I mean, if you're saying that an intersectional movement shouldn't center on any one particular group, then it seems to me like you kind of are saying that there should just be one great big movement, but if you're going to have a feminist movement, because in terms of gender inequality, women tend to be the oppressed folks, that to me isn't contrary to intersectionality. It's not contrary to intersectionality to say, well, let's have a gay rights movement, because clearly gay folks are the oppressed group in terms of sexual orientation. It wouldn't make any sense to say we need to focus on the rights of straight people.
Oh yeah, I'm hearing you. What I'm saying, I'm not saying that we should have this super group, and I am saying there should be a sort of super group, but that this isn't really an atheist type of deal. I'm talking strictly in terms of intersectionality. Intersectionality should be just this big valley of pyramids, all sort of on the same level, if that makes any sense. But I agree that even within the pyramids, the emphasis, I think, as far as the law is concerned, should be on who's legally disenfranchised. And then once the legal barriers are taken out of the way, then you start going after the social barriers. That's just my 2 cents. Okay. I won't speak any more on the evidence, or I'll try not to, but that's just how I see it.
Okay.
What I really wanted to get to was the Popperian school. This is where things really get controversial, and that's the principle of falsifiability. So I'm going to go on a little spiel right now and explain how this whole thing works to those who don't know. Falsifiability is sort of the criterion of demarcation that all
Yeah, I don't know if you guys watching can hear that, but I think King Crocoduck just cut out. Can you hear me? Hmm.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you now. You
Yeah,
cut out right at the beginning of your spiel, so you might want to go back. I don't know
yeah,
how far you got.
yeah. My screen froze. I realized, oh shit, that fucking cut. Yeah. Okay. So falsifiability is sort of the criterion of demarcation that's embraced by pretty much all natural scientists and rejected by pretty much all postmodernists. Um, it was invented by this philosopher Karl Popper back in the 20th century. At the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, you had these interesting new ideas come out: Marxist theory, Freudian psychoanalysis, Adlerian psychoanalysis. Um, a lot of interesting ideas, and you had general relativity come out at around the same in 1916, and a lot of nonsense was spoken about these theories, especially general relativity. But Popper noticed that there were some very important differences. Um, he noticed that there was a certain type of self delusion going on. For example, in Freudian psychoanalysis, um, for example, you have the Oedipal complex. It's this idea that Freud came up with. You all probably already know, but I'll just reiterate for those who don't. Um, it's this idea that the psychosexual development of young boys is informed by this innate sexual desire that they have toward their mothers. And when a boy grows up, he's probably going to end up marrying a woman who in some way resembles his mother. And it could be something very contrived, like a certain personality trait that isn't really even that dominant. But here's the deal: there's no escape. If a boy grows up and he ends up marrying a woman who in some way resembles his mother, then of course that's the Oedipal complex. But if he grows up and marries a woman who in no way resembles his mother, then that's reaction formation, which is, according to him, still a manifestation of the Oedipal complex. And so, like a two-headed coin, you still end up with exactly the same result. The Oedipal complex wins every time, no matter the situation. You see the same thing with Adler's psychoanalysis. With Marxist theory, there was potential for falsification, and it did come with the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution didn't even remotely resemble the social revolution that Marxists said would result in a socialist state being created. It didn't remotely resemble the revolution that Marx said would result in the creation of a socialist state. The reasons for that are kind of complicated. I'll invite people to read Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies. Chapter 15 gives a pretty good account of how Marxist theory failed in this respect. The followers, instead of acknowledging that Marx was wrong, they reinterpreted the theory as follows. They think that Marx taught that the all-pervading influence of the economic motive in the life of men, that they think that he succeeded in explaining its overpowering strength by showing that man's overmastering need was to get the means of living, and that he demonstrated the fundamental importance of such categories as the profit motive or the motive of class interest for the actions not only of individuals but also of the collective, and that he showed how to use these categories for explaining the course of history. They think that the very essence of Marxism is the doctrine that economic motives, and especially class interest, are the driving forces of history. But this doesn't really resemble the traditional Marxism that was initially come up with. This is a reinterpretation of Marxist theory. I believe it's referred to by some as neo-Marxism. It remains unfalsifiable, Marxist theory, because all you have to do is sort of interpret the evidence in a very different way from what Marx did, but still end up with the exact same conclusion. And this is different from how natural sciences operate. You know, you have, for example, I don't know, let's say there's gas in a chamber, and I want to find out what kind of gas it is. So I shine a light onto it, and I look at the absorption spectra. That's sort of like the fingerprint of elements, and from that I can determine, what type of gas this is. So if I look at a gas, I say, okay, this is carbon monoxide, and I shine a light onto it, and I see that the spectral lines correspond to some elements that don't make up carbon monoxide. Then my prediction has been falsified. The general rule of thumb in the natural sciences is that if it's unfalsifiable, it's not science. It's functionally useless. You can just bullshit your way through, and using some very obfuscating type of language, you can sort of cover up the fact that you're just making shit up. That's sort of the basis of falsification. If it can't be falsified, it's crap. So, with this in mind, are there any objections to anything I said so far, Steve?
No, not really. I was just, are you saying that that the reason that a given theory, for instance, neo-Marxism, would be unfalsifiable is because if it's disproven, it can just be reinterpreted? Is that what, did I catch that right?
Vastly reinterpreted. I mean,
Right.
the fun, like, it's not like it's not like a few details have changed. It's like the fundamental sort of the bottom layer, the initial axioms of the theory have to be changed in order for the conclusions to still work.
So
Yeah.
you wouldn't say that you could do something similar with a theory in physical science?
No, I don't think so.
Well, because I'll tell you, I mean, maybe where I'm getting hung up is when you said vastly reinterpreted, because I know there have been theories in physical science that,
of course, quantum mechanics, relativity.
well, yeah, but I wasn't even going there. I was going maybe to a theory that was ultimately largely abandoned, like something like steady state theory in cosmology, that was ultimately abandoned by most scientists, but was not. It took some time for it to be discarded, and there were. Fred Hoyle held on to it for quite a while, and even in the face of, in fact, I don't know if Hoyle ever actually, refuted it, but it was even in the face of all the evidence saying this isn't it, there would still be reinterpretations and rationalizations to say, well, but it's still true for this reason, and that doesn't mean that steady state theory was unfalsifiable. It just meant that there were people who were very attached to it, who were determined to find ways in which it would still fit with the facts.
Right. That does happen with science. You can reinterpret, for example, let's say the existence of redshifted galaxies, which shows that the universe is expanding. The redshift is proportional to the distance. Using a bit of contrived sort of arguments, you could potentially argue that this still allows for a steady state universe where maybe these galaxies are moving outward, but other galaxies are moving inward, and so there's a net. There's an overall zero sum, and so the universe overall is still technically a steady state. But then when you have something come up like the cosmic microwave background radiation, which came up in the 60s or something, that's when, you really can't hold on to it anymore. Now it's time to just let go. Big Bang is right. Steady state is wrong.
Right. Which is the point at which most of the hangers on finally just said, okay, that it's right. But I guess my point is that just because a theory is disproven by a particular experiment or a particular observation, and then some, instead of abandoning it, choose to reinterpret it so that it still seems to work with the new facts. That doesn't mean that it's an unfalsifiable theory. Right.
Let me clarify. I'm not saying that revisions are not allowed. They are. Every model that we have right now has at some point experienced some sort of revision. But if you want to fundamentally revise the model, if you want to say, let's say with evolutionary theory, you wanted to get rid of, for example, natural selection. I think the entire you can't. I mean, if you get rid of descent with modification, you just don't have evolutionary theory anymore. And that's kind of what happened with Marxist theory. They sort of got rid of the fundamental essence of what Marxism was about, and they replaced it with this sort of they put in this sort of psychoanalysis type of spin that made it just made it not what it used to be. And off of this, you get a lot of off of this neo-Marxist sort of change of the original Marxism, you get a lot of what feminist theory nowadays is about.
Okay, so you're saying that Marxism in its original form was falsifiable, because you're arguing that it was actually falsified by the example of the Russian Revolution.
Yeah, it's
neo-Marxism isn't.
Yeah. There's always going to be some way to save neo-Marxism. At least that's what I think history has shown. That's what Popper had argued.
Okay.
People who subscribe to the Popperian school of thought will agree. So if we apply this criterion of demarcation, we see that things start to become a little, if you'll excuse my reappropriation of the word, problematic for third wave feminism, particularly where standpoint theory and patriarchy theory come in. I don't think that there's any set of observations that could ever be made to disprove either of these. And I think that a lot of atheists who subscribe to scientific realism, which is based very strongly on this principle of falsification, I don't think that they take too kindly to this. Let me just, I guess, give a concrete. You're muted, so I don't know if.
Oh no, I was muted while you were talking. I didn't want to inadvertently interrupt you. Sorry. Please continue.
Yeah. So Okay. So let me give the example of, let's say, Taylor Swift, who, by all accounts, is probably one of the most privileged people on the planet. She'll say something along the lines of, "Oppression is in the air that we breathe." Meaning that she's keenly aware of the circumstances faced by women, even though she is, technically like one of the least oppressed people on the planet. But standpoint theory tells us that she should be this Marie Antoinette type of let them eat cake type of person, where she should be completely oblivious to the suffering of other people. Or if you want to look at it in terms of gendered term or sexed terms, where Taylor Swift is a woman, so she's in a position to talk about how she's at the bottom of this sex pyramid. We can look at you, Steve. You should be technically the Marie Antoinette. You should technically have no idea about this oppression, but you do believe in this particular power structure. Standpoint theory says that this shouldn't be the case. I would, and when I hear the explanation for this, it usually comes in the form of, oh, well, you need to get educated, and it's after you learn about these various experiences and listen to people that you can overcome this ignorance that's inherent to the people at the top of the pyramid. But in the meantime, you have Ed and Strawn and Christina Hoff Sommers, and they very much disagree with the existence of these power structures. And the explanation for this is that they're stupid, or they have internalized misogyny, or they're just trying to push an agenda, things like that. It seems to me that there's no sort of situation in which standpoint theory could ever fail. It seems very similar to Freudian psychoanalysis in this respect, whether or not that's a problem, I guess, depends on whether or not you think falsifiability is something that should be aspired toward.
Well, I think it depends on how you're applying the theory. I mean, if you're looking at standpoint theory as a school of thought, as a window through which to view things, or maybe a lens through which to view things, it makes more sense than if you were to treat standpoint theory, or really any kind of sociological school, in the same way that you would treat a scientific theory. I mean, I think a scientific theory works in a different way than, say, a feminist theory. It's possible to view a particular feminist theory as a useful way of looking at things, and it's not necessarily meant to be used in the same way as, say, a theory in a hard physical science.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think this is actually where the brunt of the controversy is probably going to emerge. Do we have this one all-encompassing epistemology of science that covers all bases that we use in all aspects of our lives? Or do we juggle multiple epistemologies and say, okay, non-falsifiability is something bad if you're doing natural science, but the rules are different when you're doing the social sciences? I guess this is kind of the debate that I'd like to start as the result of this conversation.
Right.
Do we have multiple epistemologies, or do we just have one?
Well, I think it's possible to have multiple epistemologies that simply overlap with each other. I don't think you need to stop using one in order to start using the other. I mean, I think we would both agree that a scientific.
Sorry, you cut out.
Oh, I'm sorry. Am I okay now?
Yeah. I think you would agree, and then
I think we would agree that at the physical level, if we're talking about the universe and existence in terms of physical reality, obviously we would want to try and understand that using a scientific method based model that would be falsifiable. And I don't think you need to throw that out the window if you want to examine social interactions or cultural or social phenomenon using tools that maybe don't operate in exactly the same way. You're not saying that when you interpret things through a particular, let's just say, feminist school of thought, that you are now completely throwing the falsifiable physical model of the universe out the window. You're just acknowledging that you're dealing with something that is not as predictable and not as concretely knowable, because you're dealing with human interaction, because you're dealing with things that can't always be nailed down to the point where you can draw, rock solid conclusions from them. I mean, even physical science, there's always going to be a certain level of uncertainty, usually coming from our own limitations as physical beings. Well, you'll never be able to know that a given observation is 100% accurate, because we don't have access to that kind of metaphysical certainty. But we just sort of go with it because it's the best we can do, and because things are testable and things are repeatable, and we can have practical confidence that certain scientific principles and certain scientific ideas are true enough, at least to use as foundations for predictions and reasoning and things like that. And with social sciences, you have even less confidence, but it doesn't mean that the social sciences are completely useless, or that they're
I would agree. I wouldn't go so far as to say that social sciences are completely useless. But I do find that there is a common trend. I find that social sciences that embrace the scientific method and that embrace these principles of independent verifiability and falsifiability, things like, for example, the parts of psychology that bleed into neuroscience. These things tend to be more successful. These things tend to do a better job of describing reality in a way that we can all agree upon. Even evolutionary psychology, which is very hotly contested by postmodernists and feminists especially, this is something that has resulted in some pretty good predictions, because it has followed through with the scientific method. The problem, I think, isn't so much a problem of exactness. Of course, exactness isn't really the most important thing. I mean, even in, for example, statistical thermodynamics, you're dealing with zillions and zillions of particles. There's no way you can count every state. There's no way you can, talk about them in very specific terms. The best you can do is sort of come up with these general mathematical rules, come up with this mysterious thing called entropy, and generally exactness isn't really what's the problem here. The problem, I think, is a sort of lack of methodological rigor. It seems very easy to me to basically be able to contrive anything as long as it has internal consistency, and as long as the fundamental assumptions support whatever it is you're trying to get to.
Right.
I think this can throw a lot of people off, because just because something is internally consistent doesn't necessarily mean it's true. There has to be external consistency as well. And I think this is where the postmodernists and the scientific realists depart.
Well, what would be an example of something that you would say is internally consistent but not consistent externally? I know and if this causes you to go back to evidence again, I apologize, because if we're trying to
discuss, it's all right. It's all right. I actually don't.
Give me a better idea of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I actually don't need to give as an example. Like, I could, I could go in there right now and pull out some examples. But a general example would be premise 1: Daleks hate Time Lords. Premise 2: the Doctor is a Time Lord. Conclusion: Daleks hate the Doctor. This is internally consistent. This is logically sound, but it doesn't actually have any basis in reality.
Okay.
Now, we can throw pieces of evidence in, like one of the things that Daleks do is destroy planets. And hey, we've found some destroyed planets. Let's, this is evidence for the existence of Daleks. I mean, you can throw evidence in, but it's not done in a sort of scientific manner. It's not done from the ground up. With the sort of thing, you begin with your assumption, and then you find evidence to try to fit into it. This is a problem I often find with creationists, and unfortunately, very often, when I look through, for example, the feminist literature, I see examples of this happening as well. I know you're not a big fan of Teal Deer, but he does have some pretty solid examples of this on his channel. I think this is something that's worth addressing. I think there does need to be more academic rigor in these fields if they're going to really take off.
Well, let me throw something at you, and we'll keep with the Daleks hating Time Lords argument. Just because it may not be completely reasonable to use that logically constructed argument to then generalize and say, therefore, all Daleks hate the Doctor. Given the evidence that we have seen historically from the Doctor's various adventures where the Daleks were involved, is it not at least a reasonable assumption that Daleks in general, perhaps not every individual Dalek all throughout history, but Daleks in general have a fairly negative attitude toward the Doctor?
I think there's a disconnect here. I wasn't really talking about the TV show. I was talking about real life.
Well, but I'm saying, I mean,
no.
You're saying that it's irrelevant because there's no such thing as Daleks and there's no such thing as the Doctor.
Right.
Right. So are you saying? Are you saying that if we were to that we could make a similar argument regarding feminism?
I'm saying that it could be seen that way with regard to, for example, patriarchy. Let's say I come up with this internally consistent idea of how the patriarchy works, and then I start shoehorning different evidences in, and then where counter evidence comes in, that's evidence of the patriarchy as well.
Okay.
This would run in direct opposition to the principle of falsifiability. So as an example, let's say, for example, you have a slightly higher percentage of women than men in poverty. That's patriarchy. But if a woman makes it to the top, she does so in spite of institutional oppression. Meanwhile, a man who makes it to the top does so in part because of his male privilege. But when 90% of homeless Americans are men, that's the patriarchy as well, since patriarchy hurts men too. It's very difficult, maybe even impossible, to think of any instance where patriarchy can't be blamed for something, which I think goes a long. Sorry, I just want to finish the thought really fast.
Go for it.
Which I think goes a long way to explain why several feminists will say, without exaggeration, without hyperbole, that literally everything is sexist.
I think the problem we're running into, or at least the problem that I see, is I think it's not so much that people are objecting to things being attributed to the patriarchy. I mean, I do hear people saying the kind of things that you're saying, right? That they have problems, they have epistemological problems with the very concept of patriarchy, because if you accept patriarchy as a valid model, then it's hard to get away from everything having something to do with it, right? I do hear people saying that, but more often I hear people not only rejecting the concept of patriarchy as a causal factor of oppression, but they're also either denying the existence or denying the importance of the problems that are attributed to patriarchy. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I think it's an important discussion to have, and I think that it should be definitely framed in philosophical terms.
And the thing is, there are huge debates and disagreement about this, about the role of patriarchy, the nature of patriarchy within the feminist movement itself. There are multiple competing schools of thought among feminists as to what patriarchy is, what it consists of, how it acts to oppress people, what its effect is on men, etc. But the general agreement is that whether it's due to patriarchy, whatever patriarchy is, women are oppressed culturally, economically, politically in this culture, and in most cultures, in pretty much every culture to varying degrees all around the world. That is a principle that, despite the disagreements on methodologies and on cause and effect, that pretty much everybody agrees on. And what I see from people who argue about this, is not just a rejection of a particular, model of patriarchy, but a rejection of the very idea that women are oppressed. And that, to me, is a much more fundamental problem. We can argue all day, if you want, about what is the most reasonable way of looking at patriarchy, or whether patriarchy is even the best, most useful way of looking at this. But if people are going to disagree with me, and not just me, but with the bedrock principle of feminism in general, that women are oppressed, then it seems to me just sort of a pointless semantic conversation.
Well, I think it's very important to consider it in terms of philosophy, because it seems that there are some serious fundamental flaws here. We wouldn't say that anything in science is established if it doesn't, follow through with this, if we haven't followed through with the scientific method. Like I said, I see this as a natural extension of the debate between those who embrace scientific realism and those who embrace postmodernism. Do we use the scientific method when we're trying to make a claim about the world in every instance? Or are there times when perhaps we can put these principles to the side? And as an example, I have this sort of argument all the time with a friend of mine who's she's a graduate student in feminist studies. We actually don't have gender studies here. We have like full-blown feminist studies. And it came to the point one day where I proposed this experiment where we could actually test, the extent to this patriarchy and these pyramids, how they work, and whether, whether some groups are oppressed more than others, or whether some oppression is negligible. And my experiment goes something like this. You have researcher one who goes around and surveys statistically significant numbers of people who represent various parts of various pyramids. This includes the capitalist pyramid. So you're surveying people from different economic areas. The survey includes questions that determine where a person is on the pyramid and asks for a self-report on happiness, the relationship with the family, closeness to friends, treatment by strangers, the amount of money they make, the whole shebang. It's a survey that'll tell us how oppressed the individual is, or at least feels. Researcher number two goes through these various papers and records the results. But when researcher two does this, they change the names of these groups. So like the pyramids, instead of being named black or transgendered, or the parts of the pyramids, instead of being called black or transgendered, they'll be called group 1 or group 2 or group 11 zillion, and on and on. This is to avoid primacy effects, bias from the next researcher who's actually going to analyze these groups. For example, a black transgendered man from the upper class will be called a member of groups 3, 7, and 14. Researcher number 3 is not going to know which groups correspond to which positions on the pyramid. And researcher number 3, based on these results, will assign weights to how oppressed these groups are based on their results. And from there, the researcher constructs a hierarchy that tells us which groups or which combination of groups are the most oppressed. Then researcher number 2 comes back and translates all of these groups 1, group 2 to group white, group black, group woman, group transgendered man, on and on and on. And so you would end up with a really quantitative sort of statement on how oppressed individuals are. And you end up with an actual falsifiable model on how this situation would play out. And then you go and you repeat it, and you see if you repeat the entire process with different researchers in different areas, and you see if the model actually works. So when I proposed this to my friend, she sort of freaked the fuck out. I mean, she thought it was incredibly crass to try to rank people in terms of how oppressed they are, in terms of, to see how, for example, patriarchy, the extent to which it might affect a group. And I really had a very hard time understanding this. And I still have a hard time understanding this. It seems as though, this could be the impression that a lot of people get. It would seem as though feminists don't want their models tested. And that's something that immediately raises a lot of red flags, particularly if you embrace scientific realism. I would suggest that it might be healthier for the feminist movement to be a little bit more, I don't know, I keep using the word rigorous. I don't want to come off as too much of a dick. But that's basically where I'm going. I do think that you need to test your models. I do think that it's important to be able to actually honor the falsifiable nature of inquiry. She just freaked the fuck out. The fuck out. I don't think. Feminists don't want their models tested. And that's something that immediately raises a lot of red flags, particularly if you embrace scientific realism. I would suggest that it might be healthier for the feminist movement to be a little bit more, I don't know, I keep using the word rigorous. I don't want to come off as too much of a dick. But that's basically where I'm going. I do think that you need to test your model. Basically where I'm going. I do think that you need to test your models. I do think that it's important to be able to actually honor the falsifiable nature of inquiry. I would suggest that it might be healthier.
Oh.